I thought I was looking for clarity. That's what I told myself as I stepped through the massive, gleaming glass doors of the Church of Scientology on that ordinary California afternoon. It was supposed to be simple, just one visit, a quick look around, and maybe some answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask yet. Questions about life, about purpose, about who I was supposed to be. The moment I walked in, they greeted me like an old friend. Smiling faces, firm handshakes, warm eyes that seemed to see right through me. I didn't think much of it at the time. It felt comforting, like I had finally stumbled into a place where I wasn't just another face in the crowd. They talked about understanding, about unlocking potential, about finding peace in the chaos of the world. And for the first few moments, I believed them. The building was immaculate, polished floors that seemed to shimmer under the lights, walls adorned with framed quotes about enlightenment and the power of the mind. It smelled faintly of citrus, clean and sterile, almost too perfect. They offered me a seat, handed me a questionnaire, and explained the process in a tone so calm it almost put me at ease. Almost. But then there were the questions. At first, they seemed innocent enough. What brings you here today? What are you hoping to find? They were polite, friendly even. But as the minutes ticked by, the questions shifted, digging deeper, becoming more personal, more precise. What's your greatest fear? What's the one thing you regret most in your life? The kind of questions that make your chest tighten and your throat dry out. I told myself it was fine, that this was just part of their process. But something about the way they listened, so intently, so silently, made me feel exposed, vulnerable, like I was laying pieces of myself bare in a way I'd never done before, not even with the people closest to me. I should have walked out then. I should have stood up, thanked them for their time, and left. But I didn't. I stayed. Because they made me feel like I couldn't leave, not physically, but emotionally. Like they'd already seen too much, already taken hold of something I didn't know how to take back. The next time I visited, they introduced me to the sessions. Auditing, they called it. A way to unburden the mind, to uncover the truth of who I was. They sat me down in a quiet room with dim lighting, placed a strange device in front of me, and explained how it worked. The E-meter. They said it would measure my thoughts, my emotions, my energy, whatever that meant. At first, it felt like therapy. They asked more questions, guiding me through memories I hadn't thought about in years. But the more I spoke, the more it felt like the device wasn't just measuring me, it was watching me. Like it was alive somehow, like it knew things I hadn't said out loud yet. I laughed it off, told myself I was being ridiculous, but the feeling stayed. And then there were the people. Always there, always smiling, always watching. Even when I was alone in a room, I could feel them. Their eyes, their presence, just beyond the edges of my vision. I'd catch glimpses of them in the reflections of the glass doors or the polished floors, standing still, waiting for something. One night, I stayed later than usual. I was working through a particularly difficult session, they said, something that needed extra time. The building was quieter than usual, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound I could hear. The halls, always so pristine and inviting during the day, felt different now, colder, darker, like the light didn't quite reach the corners. I remember sitting there, staring at the E-meter, trying to focus on the counselor's voice as they guided me through another round of questions. And then I heard it. Faint at first, barely audible, a whisper. But it wasn't coming from the counselor. It wasn't coming from anyone in the room. It was coming from the walls. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The counselor didn't seem to notice, or maybe they pretended not to. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet hum of the room and that whisper. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it wasn't random noise either. It was deliberate, purposeful. I asked if anyone else had heard it. The counselor smiled, shook their head, and told me to focus on the process. But I couldn't. The sound was growing louder, more insistent, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't supposed to hear. When the session ended, I tried to leave quickly, but something stopped me. As I passed one of the hallways, I saw a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of light coming through. I hesitated. Something about that door felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. I glanced around, but no one was there. The building was silent, empty, except for me. I stepped closer, the sound of my footsteps echoing softly against the walls. As I reached out to push the door open, the whispering stopped, and that's when I heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, coming from behind the door. It said my name. I don't know what I expected to see when I opened it, but what I found, I'll never forget, and I don't think I'll ever escape it. I wasn't in the best place when all of this started. You know how it is. You go through life trying to hold it all together, but sometimes things just slip. I wasn't exactly falling apart, but I wasn't exactly thriving either. I felt disconnected, like there was this invisible barrier between me and the rest of the world. Friends, family, work, it all felt hollow, like I was just going through the motions. I was looking for something, even if I didn't fully understand what it was. Maybe clarity, maybe purpose, maybe just a way to feel like I mattered. And that's when I saw it. The building. The Church of Scientology. It wasn't a special day or anything. I was just driving through Los Angeles, trying to clear my head when I passed it. It was massive, almost intimidating, but in a way that made you curious rather than scared. You couldn't miss it. The name spelled out in huge, bold letters across the top. The architecture was so pristine. It didn't feel like a church, not in the traditional sense. It was modern, sleek, like it was trying to project power and control. I didn't stop that day. I kept driving, but the image of the building stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing it more. Ads online, posters in coffee shops, even a flyer someone handed me while I was walking downtown. It was like the church was everywhere all of a sudden, like it was trying to get my attention. And then one day I finally decided to go in. I don't know why, exactly. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to fill whatever void I was feeling. Or maybe it was just that I had nothing better to do that afternoon. The moment I walked through those doors, I knew I wasn't in a typical church. The air was cold, like they kept the AC cranked up just a little too high. The floors gleamed under the overhead lights, polished to the point where you could see your reflection. Everything about the place felt calculated, perfectly arranged to make you feel like you'd stepped into a sanctuary, but not the kind you'd find in a small-town chapel. This was something else entirely. A woman greeted me as soon as I entered. She was smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile that felt warm or natural. It was too wide, too perfect, like it had been rehearsed. She introduced herself. Her name was Linda, I think, and asked me if this was my first time visiting. When I said yes, her eyes lit up like I'd just said the magic words. "Welcome," she said, her voice so cheerful it almost felt forced. "You're gonna love it here. Let me show you around." I didn't even have time to say no before she was leading me deeper into the building. The halls were spotless, lined with framed quotes and images of a man she said was L. Ron Hubbard. She talked about him like he was some kind of prophet, someone who had all the answers to life's greatest mysteries. I remember nodding along, not really knowing what to say, but there was something about her enthusiasm that made it hard to argue. She brought me to a waiting area and handed me a clipboard with a questionnaire. "This is just to help us understand how we can best help you," she said, flashing that same practiced smile. I sat down and looked at the questions. They started off simple enough, things like my name, age, and what I was hoping to achieve by visiting the church. But as I went further, they got strange. Do you ever feel like you're being watched? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? What's your greatest fear? I remember hesitating, my pen hovering over the paper. These weren't the kinds of questions I'd expected, but at the same time, they intrigued me. It felt like they were trying to dig deeper, to get to something inside me that even I didn't fully understand. When I finished, Linda came back and took the clipboard without even looking at my answers. "Great," she said, her smile never faltering. "Let's get you started." She led me to a small room where a man was waiting. He introduced himself as Mark, my counselor. He wasn't anything like Linda. His smile was smaller, more reserved, but his eyes were intense. They locked onto mine the moment I walked in, and it felt like he was trying to see straight through me. The room itself was minimalist, almost sterile. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a strange device sitting between them. Mark gestured for me to sit down, and as I did, he pushed the device toward me. "This," he said, placing his hands on it like it was some sacred artifact, "is an e-meter. It's going to help us uncover the things holding you back." I didn't understand what he meant, but I nodded anyway. He handed me 2 metal cylinders connected to the machine and told me to hold them. "Relax," he said, his voice calm and steady. "This is a safe space. Nothing you say here will ever leave this room." I don't know why, but that line stuck with me. The way he said it, so deliberate, so certain, it didn't feel like a reassurance. It felt like a warning. As the session began, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room was too quiet, the air too still. Mark's questions started out simple, but they quickly became more probing, more personal. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation, but his tone was so soothing that I found myself answering anyway. By the time the session ended, I felt drained, exposed, like I just handed over pieces of myself I didn't even know existed. Mark smiled as he thanked me for my honesty, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction, almost like he'd just uncovered exactly what he was looking for. As I walked out of the room, Linda was waiting for me. She asked how it went, but before I could answer, she was already steering me toward another part of the building. "There's so much more for you to see," she said, her voice almost giddy. And as I followed her deeper into the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just taken a step into something I couldn't walk away from. The first session wasn't as strange as I'd expected. They called it auditing. Mark explained it as a way to clear my mind of negative energy, to confront and release the things that were holding me back. He said it was like therapy, but better. Scientific, precise, foolproof. The room was dimly lit, with just enough light to see the e-meter on the desk between us. Mark's voice was calm, almost hypnotic, as he asked me questions. He started with simple things, memories from my childhood, moments of happiness, moments of pain. I didn't think much of it at first. It was easy to talk to him, to let my guard down. But then his questions began to shift. They weren't just about memories anymore. They were about fears. Deep, personal fears I'd never shared with anyone. What are you most afraid of losing? What's the worst thing you've ever done? Have you ever felt like someone or something was following you? I remember hesitating, my hands gripping the metal cylinders a little tighter. Mark didn't push, but the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to bore into mine, made it impossible to stay silent. So I answered, slowly, carefully, as if I was walking a tightrope. The session ended with Mark thanking me for my honesty and promising that we were making progress. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything he said, not directly. It was the way he watched me, like he knew more about me than I'd told him, like he was waiting for me to slip up. The next few sessions were much the same, at least at first. Mark would guide me through questions, and I'd feel that same mixture of vulnerability and unease. But the more I went, the more I started noticing things. It was subtle at first, a faint whispering sound just on the edge of hearing that seemed to come from nowhere, the sensation of being watched, even when I was alone in the room. And then there were the questions, each one cutting deeper than the last, digging into parts of my mind I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. One day, as Mark was asking me about a particularly painful memory, I heard it again, the whisper. It was so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it, but it was there. And it wasn't just a random sound, it was words. I couldn't make them out, but they were there, threading through the air like a faint echo. I asked Mark if he'd heard it. He paused for a moment, just a fraction of a second, before shaking his head. "It's probably just the air ducts," he said, his tone as calm as ever. But his eyes told a different story. The next time I went, Linda greeted me at the door with a wide smile. "Mark wants to schedule a late session with you," she said, her voice chipper. "He says you're making excellent progress." I hesitated. Something about the idea of staying late didn't sit right with me, but Linda's enthusiasm was hard to resist, so I agreed. That night, the church felt different. The usual bustle of activity was gone. The halls, always bright and busy during the day, were eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, emitting a soft buzzing sound that seemed to echo endlessly. As Linda led me to the session room, I noticed how cold it was. Not the kind of cold you'd expect from air conditioning. It was sharper, more biting, like the kind of chill you feel standing outside on a winter night. And then there was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, like burnt plastic or sulfur, lingering in the air no matter where I went. The room itself hadn't changed, but it felt different in the dim evening light. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. Mark was already waiting for me, his expression as calm as ever, but there was something in his demeanor that felt heavier. We started the session like usual, but it wasn't long before the unease began to creep in. The questions felt sharper, more pointed, like he was trying to push me into a corner. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it wasn't faint. It was louder, clearer, and it wasn't just random sounds anymore. It was my name. I froze, my hands gripping the cylinder so tightly they started to hurt. Mark didn't react, didn't even blink, but I could tell he'd heard it too. "Focus," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper itself. "You're doing great." But I couldn't focus. Not with the sound of my name echoing in my ears, not with the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to shift and move. When the session finally ended, I all but ran out of the room. Linda was waiting for me, her smile as bright and unnatural as ever. She thanked me for coming and told me I was making excellent progress. But as I walked past her, I caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Just for a moment, a flicker of something off. On my way out, I noticed a door I'd never seen before. It was small, unmarked, and slightly ajar. From behind it came a faint sound, voices, muffled and low, like someone was whispering. I told myself to keep walking, to ignore it. But I couldn't. I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty hallway. As I reached out to push the door open, the whispering stopped. And then, just as my fingers brushed the door, I heard it again. My name. Clear, unmistakable, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine and wasn't Mark's. The air around me felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. I pulled my hand back and walked away as quickly as I could, but the feeling didn't leave me. It stayed with me, all the way home, like a shadow I couldn't shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door, heard that voice, and deep down, I knew that whatever was behind it wasn't meant to be found. I told myself I wouldn't go back, not after that night. But something kept pulling at me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was fear, plain and simple. The kind of fear that makes you want answers, even if you know finding them might make everything worse. So, a few days later, I went back. I tried to convince myself it was just to clear things up, to reassure myself that everything was fine, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as soon as I walked through those glass doors, I felt it again. That weight. That chill. Linda wasn't at the front desk this time. Instead, a man I'd never seen before greeted me. He was polite enough, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He handed me a schedule and said, "Mark is waiting for you upstairs." Upstairs. I'd never been there before. All my sessions had been on the ground floor in the same small room. I hesitated for a moment, but the man didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. He pointed to a staircase at the end of the hallway, and I forced myself to move. The staircase was narrow, dimly lit, and strangely quiet. As I climbed, the air grew colder. The the smell of burnt plastic or sulfur stronger with every step. When I reached the top, I found myself in a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one was slightly ajar. I glanced at the schedule in my hand. It didn't say which room I was supposed to go to. For a moment, I considered going back downstairs, but something stopped me. The door that was ajar, it wasn't just open, it was inviting me. I stepped closer, the faint sound of my footsteps swallowed by the heavy silence. As I peered inside, I saw what looked like a storage room. But this wasn't any ordinary storage room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange, archaic-looking equipment. Machines that buzzed faintly, glowing with dim, flickering lights. Files and folders stacked haphazardly, their labels written in symbols I couldn't recognize. In the corner, there was a desk with what looked like a journal sitting on top. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The journal was open, its pages covered in messy, frantic handwriting. The words didn't make any sense, half-sentences, symbols, and diagrams that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. And then I saw it. My name, written over and over again on one of the pages, followed by phrases like progress made, unveiling potential, and resistance noted. I froze, the air in the room feeling heavier, colder. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I left the room quickly, my hands trembling as I shut the door behind me. But as I turned to walk back down the hall, I saw someone standing at the far end. A woman, her face partially obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me. I opened my mouth to say something, but she raised a finger to her lips, silencing me. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared around the corner. When I finally reached Mark's office, he acted as if nothing was wrong. He greeted me with his usual calm demeanor, asking how I'd been, if I'd had time to reflect on our previous sessions. I wanted to ask him about the room, about the journal, about the woman in the hallway. But I didn't. Something in his tone, in the way he looked at me, made me feel like I shouldn't. The session was uneventful, but my mind was racing the entire time. As I left the office, I saw the woman again. This time, she was closer, standing near the exit. She caught my eye and motioned for me to follow her. I hesitated, but something in her expression, desperation, maybe fear, made me take a step toward her. She led me to a side door, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds as if she was afraid someone was watching. When we were outside, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "You need to leave. Now. Don't come back." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head, her grip tightening. "They know everything about you," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything. And if you stay, you won't get out." Before I could say anything else, she was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. I didn't know what to think. Was she trying to scare me? Was she telling the truth? My mind was spinning with questions, doubts, fear. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this place. And then, as I was pulling into my driveway, my phone buzzed. A text, no name, no number, just a single message, "Stop asking questions." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I hadn't told anyone about the room, the journal, the woman. So how did they know? That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every shadow on the wall felt like a warning. And the worst part, I still didn't have answers, but I wasn't sure I wanted them anymore. I didn't go back to the church for weeks after that. Every time I thought about it, I could hear the woman's warning in my head, "You won't get out." But the questions wouldn't leave me alone. Why was my name in that journal? What did they mean by resistance noted? And what was behind that locked door at the top of the stairs? The text message I'd received only added to my paranoia. I changed my phone number the next day, but the damage was already done. I felt watched, like someone was following me wherever I went. I'd catch glimpses of people I thought I recognized from the church, standing on the other side of the street, sitting in parked cars, lingering just a little too long in grocery store aisles. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it wasn't curiosity. Maybe it was something else, something deeper, pulling me back despite the fear. I told myself I needed closure, that I needed to confront whatever was happening there. So one night I drove back to the church. It was late, just past midnight. The building looked almost peaceful under the soft glow of the streetlights, but there was something unnerving about it too, like it was waiting for me. The front doors were locked, as I expected, but I remembered the side door the woman had led me through. To my surprise, it was unlocked. The hallway inside was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency exit signs. The air was colder than I remembered, and that strange smell, burnt plastic and sulfur, was stronger than ever. I moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but as I made my way through the building, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Small details that didn't seem to fit. A door with a keypad lock that looked out of place in a church. Cameras positioned in odd corners, their red lights blinking faintly. And then I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere deeper in the building. The sound was faint at first, almost like a hum, but as I followed it, it grew louder. The words weren't in English or any language I recognized. They were sharp, guttural, almost painful to hear, like they weren't meant for human ears. The sound led me to a large set of double doors at the end of a hallway. They were slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the faint flicker of candlelight spilling out into the corridor. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave while I still could. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind those doors. I pushed them open just enough to peek inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was massive, far larger than any other I'd seen in the church. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and artifacts, old, strange-looking things that seemed ancient. At the center of the room was a circle of people, their faces hidden behind ornate masks. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling in unison, creating a sound that was almost hypnotic. In the middle of the circle stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its features obscured by the flickering candlelight. There was something about the way it moved, slow, deliberate, inhuman. The chanting grew louder, the words sharper, more frantic. The figure raised its arms, and the room seemed to vibrate, the air itself growing heavier. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like I was being pulled toward the circle, like something was reaching out for me. And then it turned. Even with the shadows and the masks, I knew it saw me. The chanting stopped abruptly, the silence more deafening than the noise had been. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and ran. The hallway seemed longer than it had been before, stretching endlessly in front of me. The lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, getting closer. I turned a corner and spotted a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and as I reached it, I slipped inside and shut it quietly behind me. The room was small, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of old documents. In the corner was a desk with a strange machine sitting on it. It looked similar to the e-meter, but larger, more complex, covered in wires and dials that hummed softly. I rifled through the papers, my hands trembling. Most of them were incomprehensible, charts, symbols, diagrams. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. Photographs. Dozens of them, of people I didn't recognize. Some were smiling, others looked confused, scared. And then there were the files, records of their sessions, details about their lives, their fears, their secrets. At the bottom of the stack was a folder with my name on it. I opened it, my hands shaking. Inside were pages of notes, everything I'd ever said during my sessions, every memory, every fear. But there was more. Diagrams of the e-meter, annotated with strange symbols, notes about progression and resistance. And then at the very bottom, a single photograph. It was me, sitting in one of the session rooms, holding the e-meter cylinders. But it wasn't taken during any of my sessions. The angle, the lighting, It was from above, like it had been taken without my knowledge. The footsteps outside the door were closer now. I stuffed the papers into my bag and turned to the machine. There was a small screen on it, glowing faintly. On it were words I couldn't understand, followed by a single phrase in English. Subject compromised. Proceed with extraction. I didn't wait to find out what that meant. I opened the door just a crack and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but I could still hear the faint echo of footsteps. I ran, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The building stood silent, its windows dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me leave. I thought I was done with the church, but deep down, I knew it wasn't done with me. I thought leaving the building that night would bring some kind of relief, some sense of closure. But the moment I stepped outside and into the cold night air, I knew it wasn't over. The fear didn't leave me. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating like a second skin. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The chanting, the masked faces, the figure in the center, it all felt unreal, like a fever dream. But the folder with my name on it, the photograph, the words on that screen, those were real. Too real. When I got home, I locked every door and window, something I hadn't done in years. I sat in the living room, my bag with the stolen papers still clutched in my hands, and tried to calm down. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the house made my heart race. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move outside my window, but when I checked, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty street. The next morning, I told myself it was over. I'd left the church. I'd gotten out. But then the phone calls started. It was always the same. The phone would ring, and when I picked up, there was nothing but silence on the other end. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a telemarketer or a wrong number, but the calls kept coming. At random times during the day and night, always silence, always just long enough to let me know someone was there. And then there were the notes. The first one appeared a few days after I left the church. It was tucked under my windshield wiper, a small piece of paper folded neatly in half. Inside was a single sentence, written in sharp, angular handwriting. We know. I told myself it could have been a prank, someone messing with me, but deep down, I knew better. The next note showed up on my doorstep, tucked between the pages of my morning newspaper. This one was shorter, just a single word, stop. After that, the symbols started appearing. At first, they were small, easy to miss, scratched into the wood of my mailbox, drawn in chalk on the sidewalk outside my house. But then they got bolder. I woke up one morning to find one painted on my front door in bright red. It was the same symbol I'd seen in the church, in that room full of strange equipment. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They told me it was probably vandals, kids playing a prank. They didn't believe me when I said I was being followed. And I was being followed. I was sure of it. Every time I left the house, I'd catch glimpses of people in the corner of my eye, standing too close, staring a little too long. When I turned to confront them, they were gone. One night, as I was driving home, I noticed a car behind me. It stayed with me the entire way, always keeping just enough distance to make it seem coincidental. But when I turned onto my street and it followed, I knew it wasn't. I pulled into my driveway and watched as the car slowed to a stop at the end of the block. It sat there for what felt like hours before finally driving away. I started keeping the stolen papers locked in a safe, afraid someone might break in to take them. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to look at them again. I didn't want to know what else they might say. The worst part, though, was the dreams. Every night I'd see that room, the masks, the figure in the center, the chanting, and every night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I could still hear it, the low, rhythmic hum of their voices echoing in my ears. I tried to move on, to pretend none of it had happened. But the church wouldn't let me. The calls, the notes, the symbols, they never stopped. They weren't constant, but they were enough to remind me that they were still watching. One day, I came home to find my front door unlocked. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, but I knew someone had been inside. On my kitchen table was a single piece of paper, blank except for 2 words written in the center: "Stay silent." That was the last straw. I packed my things and left that night, moving to a new city, a new state, without telling anyone where I was going. For a while, things seemed normal. The calls stopped, the notes stopped, and I started to feel like I could breathe again. But even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that they're watching, that they're waiting for me to slip up, to say the wrong thing, to look in the wrong place. And I'll never forget what I heard that night in the depths of that church. The sound of my name, whispered by a voice that wasn't human, and the overwhelming sense that I'd seen something I was never supposed to see. I don't know what they are or what they want, but one thing is certain. The Church of Scientology is nothing like it seems, and I'm not sure I'll ever truly be free from it. This is my story, but I know it's not the only one. There are others out there, people who have walked through those same doors, who have seen things they can't explain, who have felt that same creeping unease, that same sense of being watched. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. Maybe you've been to the Church of Scientology, or somewhere like it. A place that seemed harmless at first, maybe even inviting, but left you with more questions than answers. Or maybe you've had an encounter, something strange, something unexplainable, that still lingers in your mind, just like this does for me. If you've been through anything like this, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, like someone or something was following you? Have you ever stumbled upon something you weren't supposed to see? Let me know in the comments below. And if stories like this keep you up at night, if you find yourself drawn to the unexplained, the mysterious, the things that hide in the shadows, make sure to subscribe. I have more stories to tell, stories that will chill you, stories that will make you question what you thought you knew. But be careful. Sometimes the truth isn't just unsettling. Sometimes it's dangerous, and once you see it, there's no turning back.